It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, an escape from the suffocating routine of city life. The trail, deep within the Appalachian wilderness, was touted as untouched and serene. In the online forums, my friends and I had scoured for recommendations. We wanted isolation, a challenge, and the thrill of nature at its rawest. What we got instead was something none of us will ever fully understand or forget. The drive to the trailhead took hours, winding through narrow but unmarked roads flanked by towering pines and skeletal trees. By the time we arrived, the sun hung low on the horizon, staining the sky in shades of crimson and gold. There were 5 of us: me, my best friend Sarah, her boyfriend Mark, his brother Chris, and Lisa, a mutual friend who always claimed to live for adventure. None of us were expert hikers, but we were confident enough with our gear and the maps we'd printed off the internet. The trail was gorgeous at first. Birds sang overhead and the scent of damp earth filled our lungs. As we ascended higher into the mountains, the forest thickened, and the trees seemed to huddle closer together. By the time twilight descended, the air felt heavier. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made us pause, glancing over our shoulders, but we chalked it up to animals or our overactive imaginations. We set up camp in a small clearing near a babbling creek, congratulating ourselves on our first day's progress. It started that night. I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, like the wind threading through the trees, but rhythmic, deliberate. I unzipped my tent and peeked out, half expecting to see Sarah or Mark still up by the fire. Instead, I saw nothing but darkness. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest around us was impenetrable. I froze as I realized the whispering wasn't coming from the camp. It was coming from the trees. "Hey," a voice hissed. It was Sarah, poking her head out of her tent. "Do you hear that?" Before I could answer, Chris let out a muffled curse. He'd unzipped his tent and stumbled out, flashlight in hand. "What the hell is that?" he asked, shining the beam toward the trees. The whispering stopped immediately, as if cut by a blade. We stood there, the 4 of us, straining our ears against the silence. Even the creek seemed muted, its gentle gurgling swallowed by the oppressive stillness. "Probably the wind," Mark muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. We eventually retreated to our tents, uneasy but exhausted. The next morning, things felt off. Lisa, who'd always been the most eager among us, was unusually quiet. She claimed she hadn't slept well, and though she tried to laugh it off, her hands trembled as she packed up her gear. The trail seemed different, too. Despite following the map and marked blazes, we kept circling back to the same landmarks. A jagged boulder shaped like a fang, a tree with claw-like branches, a patch of mushrooms that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. It felt like the forest was shifting around us, rearranging itself to keep us trapped. By the 3rd loop, tempers flared. Chris insisted we were reading the map wrong, while Lisa snapped that we should turn back. Sarah, usually the voice of reason, just looked pale and distracted, her eyes darting to the trees as if she expected something to emerge. When we finally found a different path, it was late afternoon, and we knew we'd have to camp again before making our way out. That night, the whispering returned. This time, it was louder, closer, and unmistakably human. It sounded like a dozen voices speaking at once, overlapping in a language none of us recognized. I grabbed my flashlight and crawled out, heart pounding. The others were already awake, huddled by the fire with wide, terrified eyes. "Did you see them?" Lisa whispered, clutching Sarah's arm. "See who?" I asked, my throat dry. "There were people," Lisa insisted, pointing toward the darkness. "They were standing right there, watching us." Chris swore under his breath and threw more wood on the fire, the flames roaring to life. The light pushed back the darkness, but it didn't make us feel any safer. The whispering grew louder, surrounding us in a maddening chorus. Shadows flickered just beyond the firelight, tall, thin shapes that seemed to sway like trees in the wind. "We're leaving," Mark announced, grabbing his pack. "Now." It didn't matter that it was the middle of the night. We didn't want to stay a second longer. We packed hastily, leaving behind anything that wasn't essential, and started down the trail with our flashlights cutting feeble beams through the darkness. The whispering followed us, growing fainter the further we walked, but it never fully stopped. Then we heard Lisa scream. She was at the back of the group, and when we turned, she was gone. Her flashlight lay shattered on the ground, its beam flickering weakly. We called her name, our voices echoing through the trees, but there was no response. Mark and Chris wanted to go back for her, but Sarah grabbed their arms, her face streaked with tears. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's gone. If we go back, We'll be next. We ran. We didn't stop until the sky began to lighten with the first rays of dawn, and the forest thinned into the familiar trailhead where we'd parked. We piled into the car, shaking and bloodied from our frantic escape. No one spoke as Mark started the engine and sped away. We reported Lisa missing as soon as we reached the nearest town. Search parties combed the area for weeks but found no trace of her, not even a piece of clothing or a footprint. The official report chalked it up to an accident, a young woman lost to the dangers of the wilderness. But we knew better. To this day, I can't set foot in a forest without hearing those whispers, faint and mocking, carried on the wind. It was the summer of 1999 when Jake, a seasoned outdoorsman, convinced his younger sister Emily and two of her friends, Mia and Eric, to join him on a hiking trip in the rugged forests of Montana. The trail he'd chosen was far from the well-trodden tourist paths. Jake liked his solitude, and this time he wanted to share the untouched beauty of nature with his sister. What none of them knew was that this trip would scar them forever. The first day was uneventful. The group laughed and joked as they made their way through dense forests and overgrown trails. By evening, they set up camp near a shallow river. The air was cool and clean, the perfect contrast to their city lives. As the fire crackled, Jake told ghost stories, trying to spook the group. Emily rolled her eyes, Mia chuckled nervously, and Eric pretended not to be affected. They all went to bed with the stars overhead, thinking the worst they'd face would be a few bug bites. But the woods had other plans. That night, Jake woke up suddenly, his heart racing for no reason. He could hear the wind rustling the trees, but there was another sound, faint but distinct, like footsteps crunching leaves just outside the campsite. He grabbed his flashlight and unzipped his tent, shining the beam around the area. The fire had died to glowing embers, casting long, eerie shadows. Nothing moved. He chalked it up to an animal and went back to sleep. The next morning, he found strange markings on the ground near the camp. Circles and intersecting lines carved into the dirt. Eric swore it was someone playing a prank, but Jake's gut told him otherwise. They decided to keep moving, brushing it off as a coincidence. The trail grew harder to follow as they ventured deeper into the forest. By midday, they realized they hadn't seen a trail marker in hours. Jake assured them they were still on the right path, but the doubt in his voice was clear. The forest seemed darker, the trees denser, and the air carried an oppressive weight. Emily complained of a strange smell, like rotting meat, but no one else could smell it. By dusk, they found a clearing to set up camp. This time, there were no jokes or ghost stories. Everyone was uneasy. That night, the noises started again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circled their tents. Mia whispered that she thought she'd seen someone, just a figure in the trees. But when they shone their flashlights, there was nothing there. Then came the laughter. It was faint at first, almost childlike, but it grew louder and more distorted. It sounded like it was coming from all directions at once, bouncing off the trees. Jake shouted into the darkness, demanding whoever it was to show themselves, but the laughter stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence behind. The next morning, Mia was gone. Her tent was empty, her belongings still neatly packed. They called her name, their voices breaking the unnatural quiet of the forest, but there was no answer. Jake found her footprints leading away from the camp, deeper into the woods. Against his better judgment, they decided to follow them, hoping she'd gotten lost or wandered off in a daze. The footprints led them to a clearing where they found Mia's jacket draped over a low-hanging branch. The clearing was wrong. It was too perfect, as if someone had meticulously cleared every branch and rock. At its center was a stone altar, slick with something dark and fresh. Eric gagged and turned away, but Jake stepped closer, realizing the markings on the altar matched the ones they'd seen near the first campsite. "Let's go," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to go now." As they turned to leave, the forest came alive. The laughter returned, louder and more deranged, accompanied by the sound of branches snapping and leaves crunching. Shadows darted between the trees, too fast to be human. Jake yelled for everyone to run, and they did, abandoning their packs as they sprinted through the woods. Emily tripped over a root and fell, screaming for Jake to help her. He grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet, but not before she caught a glimpse of something emerging from the shadows. It wasn't human. It was tall, gaunt, with limbs that bent in unnatural angles and eyes that glowed like embers. Its grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing teeth too long and sharp. They ran for what felt like hours, the laughter and footsteps chasing them relentlessly. When they finally burst out of the forest onto a dirt road, the sound stopped. The silence was deafening. They collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, too terrified to speak. A passing truck found them an hour later and drove them to the nearest town. When they told the locals what had happened, the response was chilling. "You went to Black Hollow, didn't you? People don't come back from there." Mia was never found. Search parties combed the area for weeks, but uncovered nothing, not even the campsite. Jake, Emily, and Eric never spoke of the trip again. But to this day, all three of them wake up in the dead of night to the sound of distant laughter, as if the forest hasn't finished with them yet. In the remote wilderness of Alaska, there's a trail that few dare to hike, the Ridge of Whispers. The name alone deters most people, a warning passed down by locals who refuse to talk about why. But Trevor and his girlfriend Anna weren't like most people. Adventure seekers to the core, they laughed off the superstitions as folklore meant to keep tourists from damaging the pristine beauty of the wilderness. The Ridge of Whispers breathtaking. Towering pines swayed in the crisp wind, and the mountains loomed like silent sentinels. The trail was rugged but manageable, winding through dense woods and opening up to panoramic views of snow-capped peaks. They had packed enough supplies for a 3-day trek, confident in their abilities to conquer the infamous trail. The first day was perfect. They hiked deep into the forest, laughing and snapping photos. By dusk, they'd found a flat clearing to set up camp. The stars emerged, brilliant against the pitch-black sky, and the fire crackled warmly. They were miles from civilization, surrounded by nothing but nature's beauty. But that night, Trevor woke to the sound of someone, or something, calling his name. At first, he thought he was dreaming. Carried on was faint, carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. It sounded like Anna, though distorted, as if she were speaking underwater. He sat up, heart racing, and glanced at her sleeping form beside him. She was still sound asleep. "Trevor," the voice called again, louder this time. It came from the trees beyond their campsite. Against his better judgment, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. "Anna," he whispered, shining the light into the darkness. The beam illuminated only the gnarled trunks of trees and the faint mist rising from the damp ground. "Hello?" The voice didn't respond, but Trevor felt an overwhelming urge to follow it. His feet moved as if drawn by an invisible force. He walked toward the tree line, the firelight behind him fading until he was engulfed in shadows. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the voice stopped. The silence was suffocating. Trevor realized how far he'd wandered and turned back toward the camp, but something caught his eye. A figure standing between the trees. It was pale, almost translucent, and its features were blurred, like a face viewed through frosted glass. It didn't move, but Trevor could feel its gaze boring into him. He stumbled back, tripping over a root and dropping his flashlight. When he scrambled to retrieve it and looked up again, the figure was gone. The next morning, Trevor didn't tell Anna what had happened. He convinced himself it had been a waking nightmare, a trick of his exhausted mind. They packed up and continued on the trail, though the forest now felt different. The sunlight didn't seem to penetrate the canopy, and the air was thick, making it hard to breathe. The woods were silent, too silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of their boots crunching the dirt. By midday, Anna stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Trevor froze, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing. But then, faint and distant, came the sound of children laughing. It was out of place, eerie, like the laughter you might hear in an empty playground at dusk. "We're alone out here," Trevor said, his voice shaky. Anna nodded, her face pale. "Let's keep moving." The laughter followed them, growing louder as the day went on. By evening, it was everywhere. Above them, behind them, ahead of them. It echoed through the trees, warping and twisting until it sounded like wailing. They set up camp reluctantly, though both too afraid to admit they were hearing the same thing. That night, Trevor woke again. This time, it wasn't a voice that disturbed him, but the sound of footsteps circling their tent. Slow, deliberate steps that crunched the leaves just outside. He held his breath, gripping his flashlight, and nudged Anna awake. Her eyes widened as she heard it too. "Who's there?" Trevor called, his voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. Suddenly, the tent's thin fabric began to ripple, as if something was brushing against it from the outside. Anna screamed, and Trevor unzipped the tent, shining his flashlight into the night. Nothing. The forest was empty, but the air felt charged with something unseen, something wrong. "We're leaving," Anna said, tears streaming down her face. They packed their gear in record time and abandoned the trail, using their GPS to find the shortest route back to their car. The forest seemed to close in around them, and the trees looming impossibly tall and dense. The laughter returned, louder and more distorted, until it felt like it was inside their heads. As they descended a steep hill, Anna suddenly stopped. "Trevor?" she said, pointing ahead. In the distance, just barely visible through the trees, was their car. Relief flooded Trevor, but it was short-lived. Between them and the vehicle stood a dozen figures, pale and translucent like the one he'd seen the first night. They didn't move, but their blurred faces turned toward the couple in unison. "Run," Trevor whispered, grabbing Anna's hand. They sprinted, weaving through the trees, their lungs burning with every breath. The figures didn't chase them, but the laughter and footsteps never stopped. When they finally reached the car, Trevor fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. As the engine roared to life, Anna looked back toward the trailhead. "They're still watching," she said, her voice barely audible. Trevor didn't look. He slammed the car into gear and sped away, the laughter fading into the distance. They never spoke of the Ridge of Whispers again. Weeks later, Trevor noticed something strange. Every photo they'd taken on the trip was corrupted. Blurred images, strange distortions, and in the background of every shot, the faint outlines of figures standing among the trees. The rain began to fall just as James and his friends, Sophie, Ben, and Clara, reached the entrance to the old Devil's Spine Trail. It was a notorious hiking route, winding through the heart of a vast, desolate forest deep in Oregon's wilderness. The name, they assumed, came from its treacherous ridges and sharp switchbacks, but no one knew for sure. The locals had warned them against hiking it, spinning tales of disappearances and strange occurrences. But James, always the skeptic, dismissed the stories as baseless fear-mongering. By the time they were a few miles in, the rain had turned to a steady downpour, and the dense canopy above offered little protection. The trail grew slick with mud, and visibility dropped as fog rolled in, weaving between the trees like ghostly tendrils. Still, they pressed on, laughing at their bad luck and reassuring each other they'd make it to the campsite marked on their map. But the map lied. As the sky darkened into an early twilight, they realized they'd taken a wrong turn. The trail markers were sparse, some faded and others completely absent. Every direction looked the same, tall, skeletal trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the mist. Ben tried to use his GPS, but the signal was dead. With daylight fading and no sense of direction, they decided to set up camp in a small clearing. The first sign that something was wrong came just as they were lighting the fire. Clara, who'd wandered off a short distance to gather wood, returned pale and trembling. "There's something out there," she said, her voice shaking. Sophie laughed nervously. "Probably just an animal, a deer or something." Clara shook her head. "No, it wasn't an animal. It was watching me." James tried to brush it off. "It's your imagination. This fog plays tricks on you." Clara didn't respond, but she didn't stray far from the fire after that. As the night deepened, the forest grew unnaturally silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, no distant hoots of owls. It was as if the world had been muted. Then came the knocking. It started faintly like the sound of wood tapping against wood. Rhythmic, deliberate. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from all around them. "Wind," Ben said quickly, though his voice betrayed his nerves. James agreed, though the sound felt too calculated to be natural. It continued, unbroken, for hours. When they finally decided to try and sleep, Sophie insisted they keep the fire burning. None of them argued. James woke in the middle of the night to find the fire reduced to embers. He sat up, intending to stoke it, when he noticed Clara's sleeping bag was empty. His heart sank. "Clara?" he whispered, his voice loud in the oppressive silence. The others stirred awake, and soon they were all searching the campsite, calling her name. The fog seemed to eat their voices, absorbing the sound before it could travel far. Then, in the distance, they heard a voice. Clara's voice. "Help me!" it cried, faint and desperate. Without thinking, James grabbed his flashlight and ran toward the sound. Sophie and Ben followed, shouting for Clara as they pushed through the underbrush. The voice grew louder, closer, until they stumbled into another clearing. But Clara wasn't there. Instead, they found her jacket, torn and damp, hanging from a branch. Beneath it, carved into the ground, was a perfect circle filled with strange, spiraling symbols. The air around it was heavy, oppressive, and carried a faint metallic tang. "What the hell is this?" Sophie whispered, her voice quivering. James took a step closer, but Ben grabbed his arm. "Don't," he said. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "We need to go back. Now." Before they could move, the knocking returned, louder than ever. It was deafening, coming from every direction at once. James swung his flashlight wildly, but the beam only illuminated the fog and trees. Then they saw it. A figure stepped out of the mist, tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long and thin. Its face, or what should have been its face, was smooth and featureless, a blank slate of pale flesh. It tilted its head as if studying them and then raised one unnaturally long arm to point directly at James. "Run." The word wasn't spoken aloud, but it echoed in James's mind with a force that made him stagger. He didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing Sophie and Ben, he turned and bolted back toward the campsite. The knocking chased them, growing faster and more chaotic, blending with the sound of their panicked breaths and pounding footsteps. When they reached the campsite, Clara was there. She was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, her expression blank. Her hair and clothes were soaked, and her skin was ice cold to the touch. "Clara!" Sophie cried, kneeling beside her. "Where were you? What happened?" Clara didn't answer. She didn't blink. She didn't even acknowledge them. James and Ben tried to pack up the gear, desperate to leave, but the forest had changed. The trail they'd come in on was gone, swallowed by the fog. Every direction they tried led them back to the clearing. The knocking resumed, softer now, but constant. By dawn, Clara was gone again, her sleeping bag empty and her belongings untouched. They searched, but deep down they knew it was pointless. Whatever had taken her wasn't going to give her back. When they were finally found 2 days later by a search and rescue team, James and the others were delirious with exhaustion. They told the rescuers everything, but their story was met with skeptical looks. The rescuers insisted there was no record of a trail called Devil's Spine in the area, and no one had ever heard of hikers disappearing there. But James knew what he saw, and every night since, as he tries to sleep, he hears the knocking. The old Pine Hollow Trail had been closed for years, its entrance blocked by rusted signs warning hikers to stay away. The path, locals said, had been the site of a tragedy decades ago. A search party had vanished while looking for a lost child, and no one had dared to explore it since. But to Ellie, Max, and Lauren, the warnings were just stories meant to spook thrill-seekers like themselves. They were wrong. The three friends decided to explore the trail on a cloudy autumn afternoon. The air was thick with the smell of decaying leaves, and the dense canopy above filtered the sunlight into an eerie twilight. It felt as if the forest was holding its breath. "Nothing creepy so far," Max said with a smirk, kicking a rock off the trail. "Just your average spooky woods." Ellie rolled her eyes. "Don't jinx it." Lauren, quieter than usual, trailed behind. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, though she said nothing. The trail grew narrower as they pushed deeper into the forest. The trees pressed closer, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, and a strange silence settled over the woods. No birds, no rustling leaves, only their footsteps, muffled by the thick layer of moss and wet dirt. After about an hour, they stumbled upon something unexpected. A clearing with the crumbled remains of a stone cabin. The structure leaned precariously, its roof collapsed inward and its windows gaping like empty eye sockets. Surrounding it were strange, primitive carvings etched into wooden stakes that had been driven into the ground. The shapes were crude but unnerving, spirals, jagged lines, and distorted human figures. "Looks like someone's art project," Max joked, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Ellie took a step closer to one of the carvings, her brow furrowing. "These are weird, like really weird." "Let's not mess with it," Lauren said sharply, startling them both. She stood rigid, staring at the cabin. "I don't like this place." As they debated whether to continue, a low, distant sound interrupted them. A rhythmic thump that echoed through the forest. It was faint, almost like the sound of a drum, but it carried an unsettling cadence. The friends exchanged uneasy glances. Maybe it's a woodpecker? Ellie offered, though her voice wavered. Max nodded quickly. Yeah, probably that. Let's keep moving. But as they turned to leave the clearing, the sound grew louder and closer. It wasn't a woodpecker. It was deliberate, purposeful, like someone or something was following them. Max grabbed a large stick as a makeshift weapon, and they quickened their pace down the trail. The drumming sound followed, growing louder with every step, reverberating in their chests. Then it stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. They froze, their breaths visible in the suddenly frigid air. "What the hell was that?" Ellie whispered. Before anyone could respond, Lauren gasped, pointing ahead. Just visible through the trees was a figure, barely discernible in the gloom. It was tall and hunched, its movements jerky, as though it were being pulled by invisible strings. Its head turned toward them, but its face was indistinct, shrouded by the shadows of the forest. "Run!" Lauren screamed. The three of them bolted, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. The trail blurred around them as branches tore at their clothes and faces. The thumping sound resumed, faster now, accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps that seemed to shake the ground. Max tripped and fell, crying out as his ankle twisted. Ellie and Lauren skidded to a halt, doubling back to help him. The sound of footsteps stopped just as Ellie reached him. "Do you see it?" Max panted, gripping Ellie's arm. "Do you see it?" Lauren turned, shining her flashlight wildly into the forest. For a moment, the beam illuminated the figure again, closer now. Its limbs were impossibly long, its fingers scraping against the bark of a nearby tree. Its face was wrong. Too smooth, as if it had been carved from wax and melted, leaving hollow, gaping indentations where eyes and a mouth should have been. It tilted its head, its movements sharp and insect-like, and then it screamed, a shrill, deafening wail that made their ears ring and their stomachs churn. "Get up!" Ellie yelled, hauling Max to his feet. The three stumbled forward, adrenaline propelling them faster than they thought possible. The trees began to thin, and Ellie shouted in relief as she spotted the old, rusted sign marking the trailhead. They didn't stop until they were clear of the forest, collapsing onto the dirt road that led back to the main highway. Only then did they dare to look back. The forest loomed silently behind them, its edge bathed in the dim light of dusk. There was no sign of the figure, no sound of footsteps, just an overwhelming, unnatural stillness. "We're not going back," Max said hoarsely, clutching his injured ankle. "Agreed," Ellie said, trembling. "Let's never talk about this again." But that night, as Lauren lay awake in her bed, she heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. The thumping. It was coming from outside her window. The mountain pass known as Widow's Cross had always been a subject of local legends. Nestled high in the Rockies, the trail cut through jagged cliffs and dense pine forests. People said it was haunted, cursed by the spirits of pioneers who had died trying to traverse its perilous terrain. But for Jake, Maria, and their dog Cooper, it was just another challenge. A grueling but rewarding hike for their weekend adventure. The day started sunny and crisp as the trio ascended the trail, Cooper bounding ahead with unbridled enthusiasm. Jake had read about the trail online, and while it was considered dangerous due to loose rock and sudden weather changes, he figured they were prepared. Maria had her doubts, but didn't voice them. She didn't want to be the one to chicken out. As they climbed higher, the forest grew darker, the trees twisting into strange shapes. The wind howled through the narrow pass, carrying with it a faint, almost human wail. Maria stopped and looked back. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Jake shrugged. "It's just the wind. It gets weird up here." Maria wasn't convinced, but she nodded and kept moving. They reached a small plateau by mid-afternoon and set up camp, eager to rest before attempting the summit the next day. Cooper seemed agitated, sniffing the air and growling at shadows in the trees, but Jake brushed it off. "Probably just wildlife," he said. "Coyotes or something." That night, the wind grew fiercer, shaking their tent. Jake and Maria woke to the sound of Cooper barking furiously. When Jake unzipped the tent to investigate, he found the dog standing rigid at the edge of the clearing, growling at the darkness. "Coop, get back here," Jake said, but the dog didn't move. Maria joined him, pulling her jacket tight against the cold. "What's he looking at?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't see anything," Jake replied. Then they saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the faint moonlight. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, its head cocked at an odd angle as if studying them. Cooper barked louder, his hackles raised. "Is that a person?" Maria whispered. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice echoing into the void. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. "Let's go inside," Maria said, grabbing Jake's arm. They retreated into the tent, zipping it tightly and clutching their flashlights. Cooper eventually stopped barking and returned to lie at their feet, but his low growl didn't stop. Neither of them slept. By morning, the figure was gone, and they tried to convince themselves it had just been a trick of the light, maybe a tree that looked human in the shadows. But Maria insisted they cut the hike short. Jake reluctantly agreed, and they began their descent. The trail felt different on the way down. The air was heavier, the silence oppressive. Cooper stayed close to their heels, his usual energy replaced by nervous vigilance. Halfway down, Maria froze. "Where's the trail?" she asked, her voice rising in panic. Jake looked around, his stomach sinking. The trail was gone, swallowed by the dense forest. They hadn't strayed, but somehow they were surrounded by trees that looked unfamiliar, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes. "Calm down," Jake said, trying to mask his fear. "We'll retrace our steps." But as they turned, they saw it again, the figure, now closer, standing in the middle of the path. Its face, or what should have been its face, was featureless, smooth like a blank canvas. It tilted its head again, the motion jerky and unnatural. "Run," Jake said, grabbing Maria's hand. They sprinted through the forest, dodging low-hanging branches and leaping over roots. The figure didn't follow, but its presence seemed to linger, an invisible weight pressing down on them. As they ran, Cooper suddenly stopped and began barking furiously at something ahead. Jake and Maria skidded to a halt, their breaths ragged. The figure was now in front of them, blocking their path. It hadn't walked. It was just there, as if the forest itself had placed it in their way. This time it moved. Slowly it raised one impossibly long arm and pointed into the trees. "Is it showing us something?" Maria whispered. "I don't care. We're not sticking around to find out," Jake said, pulling her in the opposite direction. But no matter which way they ran, the figure always appeared ahead of them, silent and menacing. The forest seemed to twist and shift, trapping them in an endless loop. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the oppressive darkness closed in. The figure grew closer each time it appeared, its featureless face somehow more terrifying in the dim light. Cooper barked and lunged at it, but the figure didn't react. It didn't even seem real, like it was part of the forest itself. Eventually, exhausted and desperate, Jake and Maria stumbled into a clearing. At its center was an old stone marker, covered in moss and etched with symbols neither of them recognized. The air around it felt thick and electric, buzzing faintly. "What is this place?" Maria asked, her voice barely audible. The figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, standing perfectly still, and then it stepped closer. Maria screamed as Jake tried to shield her, but the figure didn't touch them. Instead, it reached out a hand toward the stone marker. The buzzing grew louder, filling their ears until it was unbearable, and then everything went black. Jake and Maria woke hours later at the base of the mountain, disoriented and alone. Cooper was gone. So was their gear. They stumbled to their car and drove home in silence, too shaken to speak. They never found Cooper, and they never spoke of Widow's Cross again. But sometimes late at night, Maria swore she could hear barking in the distance, followed by a faint, rhythmic buzzing. It was supposed to be a quick hike, just a short detour off the main trail in the dense wilderness of Black Hollow Reserve. Olivia and her younger brother, Caleb, had planned to spend the afternoon exploring, snapping pictures, and enjoying the autumn air before heading back to the cabin they rented. They never expected the trail to lead them to something they could neither explain nor escape. The forest felt alive, whispering with the faint rustle of leaves despite the stillness of the wind. Caleb, always the adventurous one, urged them to follow an unmarked path he swore would loop back to the main trail. Olivia hesitated, but he was already bounding ahead. "We're going to get lost," she called after him. "Relax," Caleb replied, laughing. "I have a good sense of direction." They walked for another 20 minutes before Olivia realized he was wrong. The trees grew closer together, their trunks warped and bent unnaturally. The trail beneath their feet became faint until it vanished entirely, replaced by soft, mossy ground. The air grew colder, and the golden light of late afternoon dimmed, though no clouds covered the sky. "Caleb, I think we should turn back," Olivia said. Just a little farther, he insisted. I think I see something up ahead. Reluctantly, she followed him, clutching her phone as the growing unease gnawed at her. The trees parted suddenly, with this revealing a small, overgrown clearing. At its center stood an ancient, crumbling well, surrounded by a ring of smooth black stones. Thick vines draped over its edge, and an unnatural chill radiated from it. Whoa, Caleb breathed. This is so cool. No, Olivia said firmly, grabbing his arm. We're leaving. Now. But Caleb pulled free and approached the well, peering over its edge. It's dry, he said, his voice echoing faintly. There's nothing down there. Olivia stepped closer despite herself, her curiosity battling her fear. The air near the well smelled faintly of sulfur, and the black stones around it shimmered as if wet, though the ground was dry. Seriously, Caleb, let's go, she insisted. Hold on, he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a coin, grinning at her. Let's make a wish. Don't, she said sharply, but he'd already tossed the coin. It disappeared into the darkness, and for a moment there was silence. Then came the sound. A faint, wet, scraping noise echoed from the well, growing louder and more distinct. It wasn't just coming from below, it seemed to resonate from the air itself, filling the clearing with an unnatural hum. Olivia's stomach twisted. Caleb, we need to run, she said, her voice trembling. But Caleb didn't move. His eyes were locked on the well, his face pale. Did you hear that? He whispered. The scraping stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint, whispering voice. It was impossible to tell what it was saying, but it was soft, insistent, and wrong. Olivia grabbed Caleb's arm and yanked him backward. Run, she screamed. This time, he obeyed. They sprinted back the way they came, their hearts pounding as the forest seemed to close in around them. The whispering followed them, growing louder, more distinct, though Olivia still couldn't make out the words. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, and the trees seemed to lean toward them as they passed. This isn't the way we came, Caleb shouted, his voice breaking. Just keep moving, Olivia yelled back. They ran until they stumbled into another clearing, different from the one they'd left, but equally unnatural. At its center was a tall, twisted tree with no leaves, its bark black and glistening. Hanging from its branches were dozens of objects, bones, rusty tools, tattered fabric, and small wooden effigies shaped like human figures. What is this place? Caleb whispered, his voice shaking. Before Olivia could answer, a sound froze them both in place, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The shadows beneath the tree shifted, coalescing into something solid. A figure emerged, hunched and twisted, its limbs unnaturally long. Its face was obscured by a dark hood, but the air around it shimmered with malice. The whispering returned, louder now, and Olivia realized it was coming from the figure itself. Its voice was a chorus of whispers, each overlapping the other, filling her head until she thought she would scream. Stay back, Caleb shouted, brandishing a stick he'd grabbed from the ground. The figure tilted its head, as if amused. Then it lunged. Caleb swung the stick, but it passed through the figure as though it were made of smoke. The creature's hand, a long, bony claw, reached for him. Olivia reacted instinctively, grabbing Caleb and yanking him away. They ran, blind with terror, crashing through the underbrush. The whispering pursued them, joined now by the snapping of branches and the heavy thud of footsteps. Olivia didn't dare look back. She gripped Caleb's hand tightly, pulling him along as they stumbled through the trees. Then, as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. They burst through the tree line onto the main trail, the familiar dirt path stretching before them. The forest was quiet again, bathed in the fading light of dusk. They didn't stop running until they reached the parking lot, collapsing onto the gravel beside their car. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stared at the edge of the forest, waiting to see if something would emerge. It didn't. Let's go, Olivia finally said, her voice hoarse. Caleb nodded, his face pale and drawn. They climbed into the car and drove away without looking back. Weeks later, Olivia couldn't shake the memory of the well, the whispering, and the figure. One night, as she lay in bed, she reached into her jacket pocket and froze. Her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. She pulled it out, a coin, identical to the one Caleb had thrown into the well. Her blood ran cold as the whispering began again, faint but unmistakable, coming from the dark corners of her room. The Mistwood Trail was famous for its fog. Even on sunny days, a thick, swirling mist lingered in the forest, giving the trees an otherworldly appearance. Locals avoided the trail, claiming the fog wasn't natural, that it hid things no one should see. But for Allison, a seasoned hiker, the warning sounded like baseless folklore. She decided to tackle the trail alone one early morning, her camera in hand to capture the ethereal beauty of the mist. The hike started peacefully. The forest was quiet, save for the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional call of a distant bird. The mist curled around her, cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of earth and pine. Hours passed, and the trail grew harder to follow. The fog thickened, swallowing the sunlight and muting the colors of the forest. Allison checked her map and GPS, frowning when neither seemed to align with her surroundings. She paused to get her bearings when a sound broke the silence, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was too deliberate to be natural, like someone knocking wood against wood. She turned in the direction of the sound, calling out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The tapping stopped. She waited, holding her breath, but no one responded. After a moment, she shook her head and continued forward, chalking it up to a woodpecker or an animal she couldn't see. The trail became stranger the farther she went. The trees grew taller and denser, their trunks twisted like tortured sculptures. The mist felt heavier, as if it were pressing against her skin. And then she noticed something else. There were no sounds, no birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. Unease crept into her chest, but she forced herself to keep moving. She'd turn back soon, she decided. Maybe she'd already gone far enough. The tapping returned, louder this time. It came from somewhere behind her, accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps. Her heart quickened. "Is someone following me?" she murmured to herself. She stopped and turned around, scanning the fog. There was no one there. "Allison, stop freaking yourself out," she said aloud, trying to steady her nerves. She took another step forward. Snap! A twig broke underfoot, but not her own. It came from somewhere just ahead. Her breath hitched as she squinted into the mist. The forest seemed to shift, the shapes of the trees warping and blurring. Then she saw it. A figure stood in the distance, barely visible through the mist. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its posture hunched. The fog obscured its face, but she could feel it staring at her. Allison's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. The figure tilted its head, as though curious, and then took a step toward her. Its movement was unnatural, jerky, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. That broke her paralysis. She turned and bolted, her heart pounding as she retraced her steps down the trail. The mist seemed thicker now, clinging to her like a living thing. Every so often she glanced back, but the figure was gone. Still, she could hear it. The tapping, the snapping of branches, the sound of something moving just out of sight. Her lungs burned as she ran, desperate to find the trailhead. But the forest didn't look the same. The path twisted in directions she didn't recognize, leading her in circles. And then she saw them. Carvings on the trees, shallow etchings that hadn't been there before. They were crude symbols, spirals, crosses, and shapes resembling eyes. The sight made her stomach churn. She didn't stop to inspect them. The tapping grew louder, echoing through the forest like a heartbeat. It was no longer coming from behind her. It was everywhere, surrounding her. She stumbled into a small clearing, gasping for breath. In the center was an old wooden structure, barely standing, its planks rotted and covered in moss. It looked like a shrine, its surface covered in more of the strange carvings. The air was colder here, and the mist seemed to pulse, swirling faster around her. The tapping stopped. A silence more deafening than any noise settled over the clearing. Allison turned her back to the shrine and froze. The figure was there, closer than before. Its body loomed impossibly tall, its head brushing the lowest branches of the trees. She could see it more clearly now. Its skin was pale and stretched too tightly over its bones, its face featureless except for hollow, gaping eye sockets. It raised one elongated arm, pointing at her with a single claw-like finger. "No," she whispered, backing away. "No, no, no." As she moved, the figure's hand dropped, and it stepped forward. The motion was slow, deliberate, as though savoring her terror. The fog churned around it, and she swore she could hear whispers, hundreds of voices, overlapping in a chaotic murmur. Allison ran again, tears streaming down her face. She didn't care where she was going, she just needed to get away. The whispers followed her, growing louder until they were a deafening roar. Suddenly, she burst through the mist and onto the main trail. The sunlight hit her like a slap, and she collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. The forest was quiet again, the mist retreating as if it had never been there. She didn't look back. She couldn't. When she finally reached the trailhead, she climbed into her car and sped away, her hands trembling on the wheel. She promised herself she'd never return to Mistwood. But as she drove, she glanced at her rearview mirror and froze. The mist was following her, and in the distance, barely visible, was the figure standing motionless in the road.